7 News, first at 10. A jet leaves Miami International Airport. Moments later, it crashes in the Florida Everglades.
Continue to look for survivors. We have found none at this time.
More than 100 people on board, all presumed dead.
We have found several parts with apparent soot damage of interior material.
My son died because of greed. Unbelievable.
Maybe the company's first crash, but the airline is no stranger to catastrophe. From the crash site, from Miami International Airport to Atlanta, 7 News bringing you extensive Team 7 coverage on the crash of Flight 592.
Founded in 1992, ValuJet was the brainchild of a conglomerate of industry experts and former airline executives that had experience and relative success prior to their new startup. They had hoped that their airline would be able to tap into the relatively small and emerging low-cost carrier market. The airline, assigned the aircraft call sign of Critter by the FAA due to the cartoon airplane caricature as its livery, had increased their fleet 15-fold by their second year in, kept operating budgets low, and had shattered earnings expectations consistently. However, little did they know that this approach of ultra cost-cutting, which brought initial success, would spell its downfall only a few short years later. May 11th, 1996. ValuJet Flight 592, a DC-9, pushed back from the gate at Miami International Airport and began to taxi to runway 9 left. The flight, bound for ValuJet's central hub of Atlanta, was a routine trip that would take approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes. The crew in command were some of the airline's most experienced pilots. Captain Candlin Candy Kubek had been involved in aviation her entire life and had always been eager to get back into the skies. She celebrated her 35th birthday the day before. The crew threw her a party on board the jet. Her first officer is Richard Hazen, who had worked as an airline pilot before being hired by ValuJet and had accumulated over 2,000 hours of experience on the DC-9. The first critical phases of the flight went off without a hitch. The aircraft was reaching 11,000 feet, and the crew were discussing a distant thunderstorm when a loud, audible bang rang through their headsets. Electrical systems on board the aircraft quickly began to fluctuate and slowly began to fail. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the pilots radioed air traffic control requesting to return back to Miami International Airport. It was around this point that a flight attendant burst into the cockpit to confirm the pilot's worst fear. Smoke is billowing through the floor at an alarming rate. There is a fire on board. Radar picks up the aircraft, making a turn back towards the airport, and the air traffic controller talks with the flight crew, offering them radar vectors and possible alternates if need be. Soon, though, his radio calls would fall upon deaf ears. The passengers and crew had succumbed to the smoke and toxic fumes. The DC-9 maneuvered erratically, entered into a dive, quickly losing several thousand feet. For a few moments, the aircraft leveled off and began a slight bank back towards Miami, although this would not last long. Moments later, the aircraft banked sharply and made one final dive towards the earth. It slammed into the Florida Everglades, traveling 441 knots. The body of the aircraft impacted the limestone layer underneath the swamp, which instantly shattered the fuselage. An airline pilot in the area radioed Miami Air Traffic Control on the frequency to inquire them if Critter had made it out all right. The frequency remained silent. There were a number of witnesses that saw the crash. Even a private pilot enjoying a weekend flight saw what happened and radioed Miami to provide them a location. They all said the same thing. A large jet moved erratically through the sky, dived, banked steeply nearly on its side, and plummeted into the swamp below at a high rate of speed. Although they called for help and rushed to the scene in airboats to assist with the recovery of survivors, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. The only visible trace of the DC-9 were tiny pieces of shrapnel, part of an engine, and the smell of jet fuel burning their nostrils. Within hours, the rescue recovery drew to a grim close, and the NTSB arrived on scene to begin their investigation. For 6 weeks, investigators would recover pieces of wreckage, recover the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, gather witness statements, and begin to piece together what happened. About 70% of the aircraft wreckage had been recovered from the swamp and was shipped to a local airport hangar, where a three-dimensional reconstruction of the forward fuselage had been painstakingly assembled. Each piece, combined with air traffic control transcripts, data, and recordings from the black boxes, provided the investigators with an undeniable cause for the crash. A fire broke out on board Critter 592. How could a fire with such catastrophic ferocity occur on board in an airtight cargo hold? That was the next question the NTSB set out to answer. A review of the cargo manifest yielded peculiar results. A last-minute shipment of company material, labeled as COMAT, arrived at the gate just before pushback. The COMAT, 5 boxes of what was written on the cargo manifest as oxy canisters empty, and 3 aircraft tires. In order to determine more information about the COMAT, the NTSB turned to ValuJet, who pointed them in the direction of their aircraft maintenance subcontracting company, SaberTech Incorporated. All of the material had been contracted to be removed by SaberTech from 3 MD-83s, which ValuJet had recently purchased. The indication of oxygen canisters initially did not raise suspicion among the investigators. Upon further clarification from SaberTech employees, though, a much more significant discovery was made. The canisters were actually passenger oxygen generators. The generators are constructed of stainless steel and contain a percussion pin on one end of the cylinder. Inside are several chemicals, such as sodium chlorate, that when initiated by a small explosion caused by the striking of the percussion cap, create the oxygen used by passengers in the event of a cabin decompression. This reaction is also exothermic, producing an extreme heat in excess of 500 degrees Fahrenheit. An interview of employees at SaberTech was conducted in order to gain a better understanding of how they performed the removal work. The specific generators in question on the manifest, 144 of them, were removed from the aircraft some months before, stored in 5 boxes with a sheet of bubble wrap on top, and the top half of the cylinder lanyard was taped to the side of the generator to ensure it would not discharge. The proper protocol called for a yellow plastic cap to be installed that would ensure such a discharge could not occur. However, the safety caps could not be found, so the workers improvised, but marked in the paperwork that the procedure had been done to standards. The boxes were then stored in the SaberTech warehouse on a parts shelf and were not given labels as to what they were, if they were discharged or not, or that they were hazardous. Weeks after the work was performed, mechanics eventually moved the boxes into SaberTech's shipping and receiving department and placed them on the floor in an area that was allocated to store ValuJet property. A manager instructed one of the shipping clerks to clean up the department for an impending audit by a potential customer, and the clerk began the process of getting the boxes ready to be shipped back to ValuJet Headquarters in Atlanta. The clerk had a coworker fill out a release slip for the cargo, to which the worker wrote that they were oxy canisters empty, and the box was labeled as aircraft parts and ValuJet COMAT. The boxes sat until May 11th, when a SaberTech delivery man had time to fit the drop-off into his route. At the gate, a ValuJet ramp agent accepted the material, let the first officer know about the last-minute change, and had ramp workers load the COMAT into the forward cargo hold. Curious as to whether or not the generators could cause a severe enough fire to burn through the floorboard and damage the control lines of the aircraft, the NTSB investigators devised a test in a forensic fire laboratory. They would place an oxygen generator into a box, load it into a plexiglass container to simulate a Class D cargo hold, and initiated the generator. Although a small fire occurred, it was nothing that would pose an imminent threat to bring down an airplane. They then made the test more realistic by loading more generators, adding luggage, and the 3 aircraft tires. One of the generators was pulled, and eventually, a massive inferno engulfed the test cargo hold. Temperatures reached in excess of what the equipment could measure. The aircraft tires began to explode, which yielded an answer to one of their final questions regarding the origin of the loud banging noise the crew had heard at the beginning of the disaster. The investigators theorized that while taxiing to the runway, some of the generators may have gotten jostled, which caused their inadvertent activation. They continued to heat up until a fire was inevitable. By the time the jet reached 10,000 feet, the smoke made its way into the cabin. The fire was melting its way through the metal floor frame, destroying vital control lines of the aircraft. Electrical systems on board began to short-circuit and fail. The flight crew leapt into action as their training had prepared them to do, but thick smoke began to pour into the cabin and cockpit. The CVR recorded the ensuing panic. After 15 months of investigation, the time had come for the NTSB chairman to gavel in the hearing that would present the world with their final report on what downed ValuJet 592. The hearing compiled extensive research of wreckage, records, maintenance and airline operating procedures, data gathered through the black boxes, and the compilation of various tests conducted by investigators. The report listed the probable cause as a fire that broke out on board the aircraft due to the accidental activation of one or more oxygen generators. Moreover, the report goes on to assign blame to 3 specific parties. First, the maintenance subcontractor SaberTech for improperly packaging, dismantling, labeling, and preparing the oxygen generators for shipment. Next, ValuJet for not properly supervising SaberTech. Finally, the FAA for not following the NTSB's prior recommendations for fire detector and suppression equipment to be mandatory in cargo holds, and for not cracking down on ValuJet earlier on. They produced a sweeping list of recommendations, chief of which was a reaffirmation of their original advice to make fire suppression and detection equipment mandatory in all Class D cargo holds. SaberTech was fined $500,000 by the FAA. However, they would go bankrupt a few short years after the ValuJet crash, having lost nearly all of their customers. They would ultimately go on to never pay that fine. ValuJet would undergo one of the most intensive audits in aviation history before resuming operations months after the crash. The damage was already done. No one wanted to fly on a ValuJet aircraft, and the Critter became a caricature of death. Therefore, the company bought out another airline, dissolved the ValuJet Corporation, and operated under the other airline, AirTran Airways. The lessons learned from ValuJet clearly stuck. AirTran would go on to be the safest airline in America until Southwest Airlines liquidated them in 2011. The ValuJet 592 crash acted as a catalyst that exposed many of the systemic flaws that were deep within the structure of the FAA. Because of the subsequent investigation, the chief regulator lost his job, and so did the administrator. Those that had warned about ValuJet in the months following up to the crash would no longer be brushed off. The coziness between regulators and airlines, which was revealed to the world, had a margin which was too close for comfort for many, and in this case, something was done about it. Decades before the 2008 financial crisis brought along the collapse of Lehman Brothers Investment Bank, and the coining of the term too big to fail, there was ValuJet. In an attempt to meet their public promises of low fares and ever-growing growth projections, the airline had to continually spread themselves thinner and thinner. So much so, many referred to them as a virtual airline due to their lack of cohesive infrastructure. In the realm of safety enforcement, to use one example, ValuJet was not allowed to transport hazardous materials such as oxygen generators, expended or otherwise. The ramp agent should not have allowed the materials on board the aircraft, and the importance of recognizing such materials was repeatedly stressed in ValuJet's standard operating procedures. However, this was not the case, and the cargo was allowed to be loaded. Even the first officer, who was alerted to the cargo, did not give it any further interrogation, as he should have, and went on with what was going to be a normal flight. Although these warning signs can be easily seen now with full clarity, airline executives were mostly oblivious to the dangers they were beginning to wade through. The more contractors they hired and corners they cut, the closer they were to the precipice, skirting tragedy only by happenstance. It would all come crashing down on May 11, 1996, when Critter 592 left Miami for the final time. A systemic buildup of unhelpful attitudes, what pilots would refer to as hazardous attitudes, infected all backgrounds and fronts of the aviation industry. For the employees at SaberTech, it was the idea of continuing to do something because that's how it always has been done, and an ever-lowering relaxation of safety standards in the workplace left many of the workers to continue doing what they thought was right, not because they maliciously sought to break rules, but because they were unaware of any other way to do it. Little effort was made to replace the safety caps necessary for the oxygen generators when they were discovered missing. Instead, the workers did the next best thing by taping the lanyards and boxing up the generators without any hazardous material labels. All 3 parties, the FAA, ValuJet, and SaberTech, had all been guilty of that kind of mindset. Although normally a tragedy is avoided, all 3 shortcomings aligned to down ValuJet 592. It highlights the duplicity of a culture of complacency. Even though it has been 24 years since ValuJet 592 crashed and the changes it spurred have been implemented, there are still sobering echoes that can be heard to this day. The recent 737 MAX crashes have once again raised serious safety questions about the ethics and relationship between the FAA and private corporations, as well as call into question its ability to effectively govern the safety of air travel. Low-cost carriers are still under scrutiny for their practices, as seen in the revelations surrounding the poor safety record of ValuJet Airlines, and a recent string of cargo aircraft crashes has the Federal Aviation Administration conducting tests and analysis into the impacts overheated lithium batteries can have on aircraft, in particular cargo holds. The results so far yield eerily familiar results. It is a more modern reminder to not be so quick to forget about the past, because the mistakes made now could be the same ones that doomed the passengers and crew on board Critter 592.
What was once a preventable tragedy whose story left the country stunned and demanding answers is now remembered through a quiet shrine that points onward to where the crash occurred. These 110 pillars, one for each of the 110 passengers and crew that lost their lives in the remote sawgrass of the Florida Everglades, represents the impact that their sacrifice has had on making air travel safer for the future of the flying public. The ValuJet 592 Memorial is not just a grim reminder of the countless lives lost, but also stands as a testament to the countless lives that have been saved.